correctly with the correct amount.
D20 Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.
Welcome to Me and Steve Talk RPG, the podcast where me and my friend Steve try and help you get the most out of your role-playing game experience. Hey folks, welcome back to Me and Steve. I'm Steve, and I have an honorary Steve with me this week. Say hello, honorary Steve.
Hey everybody, good to be back.
Yep. Joining me this week is going to be JT Dimino, who's, he's been on the show at least 3 times before because that's how you become an honorary Steve. He's also a good friend from Gamer Nation Con and just the D20 network as a whole. Amongst other things, he serves as the community manager for like Discords and the Facebook group and all that fun stuff.
Yep, and just doing all the odds and ends behind the scenes where I can.
Yeah, you're intermittent podcaster and all sorts of fun stuff.
Oh yeah.
But on the subject of the D20 Radio Network, we want to welcome a new member to the network at this point, that being the We Fix Games podcast, which is run by, I know one of the hosts is Laura, who I have met at Gamer Nation Con. Very, very cool. And of course, there's the thing that I was looking for. Now, why does it always scroll away? There it is. We Fix Games dives deep into the story side of video games, what worked, what didn't, and how we'd make it better. It's part thoughtful critique, part chaotic brainstorm, with plenty of laughs, hot takes, and a fair bit of cussing. Come for plot holes, stay for the unhinged redesigns. So I have not actually gotten a chance to listen to any of their shows yet, but you said you have.
Yes, and I'm also acquainted with Laura and their co-host Jerica, and they're running a pretty fun show, I think. If you like video games, they do a lot of deconstructing with the plot and sort of like the interactive elements. So if you've ever been the sort of person that likes to talk about video games and talk about like, how they did, this scene or that, and what works mechanically and story-wise and all that other stuff, that's basically what they're talking about. So you'll get a kick out of that.
Very, very cool. So we have a topic for this week, and just to, not that if you're a regular listener, you probably haven't figured out that my brain is a very strange place to live, but I got to this topic through listening to an album on my way to work. And because I'm a cheap SOB and I drive an old car and et cetera, I was listening to music on this crappy little Bluetooth speaker that I have from somewhere. I don't even remember when I got it. So I was playing the Megadeath album, Peace Sells, and the title track came on, and one of the things, if you're familiar with the song, it has a really kind of memorable bass line that introduces the song, right? It's how the song comes in. And I'm driving along and listening. I'm like, wait a minute. I didn't hear the intro to this song. And so I kind of went, and this got me to thinking, like, obviously that speaker doesn't have the bass output to bring that up to the forefront, to where I could actually hear it in the car because of car noise, et cetera. But that got me thinking, like, as a GM, sometimes when that game or that session isn't going the way you want it to, is it because we as GMs aren't articulating or emphasizing the right things, much the same way my speaker wasn't putting out the frequencies that were what I expected to hear,
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting topic. So thank you for inviting me on, because I definitely have some thoughts. But I do think you're right. I think sometimes when things sort of get lost in translation, it can be an issue of the GM maybe not getting the point across or struggling to communicate the main goal of whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish.
And like I'm not saying, look, we're not a communication podcast, right? We're not going to teach you all the things to get your point across, but I thought at least something worth discussing and maybe talking around some things that, could help with it.
Yeah, I mean, half of the time, no one understands me anyway. So, I mean, we'll even see if, what we can do with that. But
Yeah, like, I don't know. It just, like, because 'cause I've had that happen at times where, like, I'm running a session, and it's not that people aren't having fun, but it's not going where I, at least in my mind, expected it to go. And I have learned that I make associations that other people don't, and so I try to be conscious of not depending on those associations in games, but I think this goes a little beyond that, and it may be, are you not it could just be, how are you speaking? Are you doing a kind of slow, you want it to be suspenseful, but because you're nervous and all adrenalined up, like this happens to me all the time when I'm running games, I'm rattling away 1,000 miles a minute. But I want it to be kind of more slow and suspenseful. And so does that not translate into what the players are hearing, even though the words are there, the delivery could maybe be making a difference.
Sure. Yeah, and I've been there too, so I totally understand. I think most of our listeners probably, if they've ever run a game, sort of know that experience as well, where what you're trying to deliver to the group is not sort of what is coming through, and it's interesting to try to troubleshoot that. And I think a lot of times, like you were saying, it definitely can be a matter of maybe you're not communicating the way you had wanted to, but also it's a two-way street, of course. So, sometimes there is sort of just a breakdown where, like you were saying, if there's a reference in there and, you're the only one who gets it, then maybe that just doesn't come across well. There's that boundary there. I think one of the best ways to try to ensure that you are getting your point across and making sure that the players are going to understand where you're going with things is, and this doesn't have to be something where you have to write out a whole outline for your session or whatever, because at least for me, I rarely ever do more than just like a very basic idea for my sessions and sort of improv a lot of it. But having a goal at the beginning of a scene that you're running, for example, I think goes a long way, because if you don't know what the point of what the scene and like what the action is that is going on, then you probably won't be able to do the best job you can sort of communicating and sort of coming through with that point. So, if you start a scene and you're just like, okay, well, we've got some time to kill. I have to, we're going until 8, so let me just throw them in a situation and have them role play. That's great, and a lot of times players will have a ton of fun with role playing. But if there's no real point or end goal for it, then it's going to be very up in the air in terms of like, okay, well, when do we stop, or when do we like switch to something else? And your players may be expecting, oh well, if we're doing the scene and we're all just sort of like hang out in the ship, maybe there's something we're missing here, or maybe something is going to eventually be thrown in to take us into the next part of the adventure or whatever. So if you don't communicate well with what the goal of the scene is, then I think you could end up having problems.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I think, and that's helpful because I'm very much like you, largely an improv GM. A lot of times I'll have a loose something in my mind, again, often kind of a goal. But as to how we get there, I'm often very, very fluid and just improvise based off the players do this, so that this happens. And that's that's fine, right? Like I do that. You said you do that a lot. But I think, like you said, you do have to have some sort of a plan. And I think, but that goes to, in a sense, right? If you don't know what your plan is, how can you effectively communicate the tone or whatever? You know?
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so, I think you have to sort of practice that, I think, particularly if you're not, planning out all of your scenes and adventures and things in advance, or if you're just like doing a off the cuff one shot or whatever. But I think a good strategy can even be to sort of even state, maybe just not super directly, but say, okay, so we're going into this, and obviously you're looking for clues for who murdered your friend or whatever, and then you can sort of set the scene, and then everyone goes into it knowing, okay, yeah, that's right, we were trying to look for clues, so obviously we should be focused on trying to figure out what's going on. And as soon as you say stuff like looking for clues, then suddenly the players are like, okay, well, like what's around me, let me go check out, what's behind this photo or whatever, and see if there's anything there. So that just gives a jumping off point for the players too, and that helps ensure that the goal of the scene is sort of being embraced by everyone.
Yeah, yeah. I think too, right? Like there's a line there that, and maybe this is just some finesse that comes with experience and trying and not getting it right, of leading without pushing them down a specific track.
Sure.
Because I mean, we've all been there. We've all done it. We've all had it done to us as, either GMing or as players. We're like, oh, gee, there's one option here. So I don't think you don't want to go that far, or I don't know. Like, it's kind of one of those things too, though, where like I remember years ago watching an old black and white version of, I think it was Hound of the Baskervilles, and there was this scene where for like 2 or 3 seconds the camera is just focused on this painting, and like you're going, okay, and then it nothing at all is said whatever about the painting until like half an hour later when Sherlock is explaining the whole thing and he ties it back to that painting. And I think like there's a balance there of like, right, you don't want to always overly describe the important thing in the scene, because how do I want to say this? That if your players are picking up on that, then they're automatically, anytime you start describing anything in depth, they're going to go, oh, that, they're going to fix on it instantly, which is a
Exactly.
good thing. But you also, to tell a good story, don't want to telegraph too much.
Sure. And you don't want to mislead them either.
Right, right.
So if you're mentioning the painting just because you're trying to do flavor, and you didn't intend for anything to happen with that flavor, we've all had that experience, I think, where you like just describe a random NPC just to sort of give the scene some flavor, and then suddenly they want to be best friends with this NPC, and he becomes like the focus of the entire campaign, for the rest of the night, and
Right, right. No, that
yeah,
happens, right? And
yeah.
look, that is the nature of what we do, right? That's the, it's not like a video game where you click on the guy again and he says the exact same thing and you go, okay, we're done with him.
Right. Yeah.
So like, but I feel like, somehow maybe spending a little extra time on the thing that's important is good, but also try to not go overboard.
Right.
And again, like I said, I think that's a thing you have to learn, and it's kind of a feel bit, but I just feel like the whole concept is very much something worth thinking about as you're
Right.
thinking about how to run your games and whatever, because I know I've been there, man, where you have something and you're like, why don't they pick up on this thing?
Hmm. Yeah.
And very much too, right? You'll have the situation. I know it happened in a session I was playing last month where the GM even went, you know how they talk about players and that time they'll fixate on that thing that you just threw in for.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think everyone probably has that experience at some point whenever they run a game. And it's basically what you were talking about is basically just, classic Chekhov's gun scenario. If you're going to mention
Yes.
something like the painting or whatever, then it better have some relevance later, or else either, people will be misled and start focusing on it more than they want, or they'll suddenly be like, well, what was the, point of that? And that might be disappointing for them if it doesn't come back in. So who knows? I think partially getting good at describing a scene, especially like when you're setting the stage for it, like when it's just starting, can be helpful. And that is something that does usually require practice unless you're a natural. And some people are. I'm not one, so it's definitely something that I have to work at. You know, but being able to do things like describe senses and other things like that to help sort of put the players into it. But the details that you choose can be important because they do sort of lead the players potentially to focus on certain things. So like if one thing I would say is that if you're trying to just, do some flavor and set the stage, and, you're talking about being in a cantina, and you can mention the music. You don't want to say, though, like, oh, you hear the sound of this or that, coming, without giving any explanation for like why they would be hearing it. Because if they don't understand why that's happening, then they're going to say, well, oh, well, we should investigate, or, well, that's kind of weird. So obviously maybe this is something we need to look into. But if you know that you're in the cantina and you know that there's a band there, and then you're talking about, oh, you hear this music, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, yeah, there's this band playing, so that's what happens in cantinas. It's just like your typical Mos Eisley spaceport cantina type situation or whatever. So
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder too, like, because, and I think this is where we also have to be cognizant of, for example, I'm a good bit of a music nut. And so I might go into a little more detail on the music than you might, for example, just because that's a thing that I focus on.
sure.
Doesn't necessarily mean that I'm planning to do anything with it, but it could. And so I think it's a thing where you have to also learn yourself enough to know, hey, well, if I walk into a bar and a band's playing, I'm going to be looking at their gear and whatever. You might walk into the same bar, the same show, and just go, "Oh yeah, there's a band playing. It sounds pretty good." And it's
Yeah,
not,
fair.
you know what I'm saying? So like, to me, what gear they're playing might be something that I think is relevant, even though in the grand scheme it's not. And so I think what I'm trying to say is, don't necessarily include details just because you think they're important. Get to know yourself enough to know when you're adding detail that essentially really only matters to you.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah. And I think one way to sort of help with that can be just to, when you're trying to describe something, ask yourself, like, does the gear that the band is playing with have anything to do with the goal that I have for the scene? Like if they're meeting a contact there, does the gear that they're playing matter? Or, is that just something that really interests me that I'm trying to throw in there, but it might get things off track a little bit. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with throwing in some extra details. I think framing is just really important. And as soon as you see the player start thinking like, oh, he mentioned the gear, maybe we better check out like what's up with that gear, maybe try to lead them or like redirect them to a different thing. I heard some good advice that when you're trying to do like senses and descriptions, like choosing 3 senses can be good because that gives like a good rounded type of description of a place and can help. Some people tend to focus more on like what they're hearing. Some people, obviously what they're seeing is going to be important for almost everyone. If you're in the kitchens of some place, then you might smell some really interesting smells. I think that's one that doesn't get used as much.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you could also try to just incorporate a few things sort of together, and that way, hopefully, you don't end up like ultra focusing or overly focusing on that one thing that might interest you, and that'll help the players not think that that's something that they need to be focusing on more.
Yeah. No, that actually, I didn't think of it in that context, but picking, like you said, if you want to go to we'll call it a 3 senses rule, think about which senses set the mood you want more and lean to those. And you know what I mean? Like, I hadn't
Yeah.
thought about that. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think that that may have just been, like a writing class. It may have actually been the Adventure Game Academy that Keith Capel and Maggie run. But yeah, that's another thing that is sort of adjacent to the D20 radio. There is that we
Yeah.
have friend of the network Keith Capel
Hmm.
does this RPG writing class.
Yeah.
So yeah, I may have picked it up from him.
Well, no, but that's right. That's good advice, though, in general, right? Like, and I hadn't thought about it that much because it hadn't occurred to me because I know, and let's be honest, a lot of us gamer folk are in some form or other somewhat neurodivergent, even if it's
Sure.
just, maybe we're diagnosed, maybe we're not, whatever.
Mhm.
But like, I think it's really easy to overload people,
Right.
and it's also really easy to like, there's a kind of a not all that wide line to walk there at times. And
Yeah,
then
yeah.
combined with the fact that you pick up on this thing, I pick up on this thing, and I've got however many people sitting at the table, and we're trying to kind of herd them all.
Right, right. And yes, it is a balancing act because, like we were talking about, you don't want to give them too much information as to overload them or to overly focus on something that's really ultimately not relevant. But you also need to give them a little bit of something, or else every single location and scene is going to start to feel the same if there's like no description. If you're going in and saying, okay, you're in a room, it's like, okay, a room, everyone is going to have a different idea of what that looks like unless you give a few details. So, sort of being able to pick out those things, like you were saying, like choosing the three things that you think best set the mood for senses, like the hearing, sight, maybe touch is another one that probably doesn't get used as much unless
Mhm.
there's really something interesting texture wise in the room. But, just like using those three then can show you, okay, well, this is a room that's very different from the last room we were in because this one has, these crazy stuffed animal heads on the wall or whatever it might be, and
Right, and
you go
like, I
from
think
there.
there comes a point too, right? Like, as much as we keep saying you don't wanna mislead, I think part of being a good GM is not necessarily giving the players red herrings, but adding elements that are really just flavor, and then sometimes because, again, I say this all the time, this is the part of tabletop games that I love. It's that it's malleable as we're going through it. And so if your players pick up on this weird collection of stuffed animal heads on the wall, maybe somehow you get you work that somehow into your storyline that now this is an element of maybe the bad guy. Maybe it's not a bad guy. Maybe it's someone that has a clue. Maybe it's I don't know. You know what I mean? Like that thinking on your feet and it is now.
Yeah, right, right. That's a really good point. And while you were saying that, it was making me think. We were talking about come into a scene, sort of with maybe like the goal that you're trying to accomplish to help you sort of focus what you're describing and like what you're doing with the players. But you could also sort of flip it on its head a little bit, and then if you do something like describe the animal heads on the wall, then you can say, could this detail I just mentioned play into the goal somehow that I have set for the scene? And if the players really do seem to be picking up on the animal heads and really enjoying it, then that could be something that it lets you know, okay, yeah, no, this is something that I should maybe try to incorporate into the goal if they're really that interested in it.
And I think you can do that in 2 ways, like, I'll point at something, Daryl and the How We Roll crew, they ran a 3-part Delta Green scenario at this past Gamer Nation Con, and I played in all 3 sessions, and the core of their thing was around Bob Ross, and Daryl even mentioned, one of the things that he said it came out in playtesting, and not surprising, was that none of the players didn't really want to believe that Bob Ross was a bad guy because he's Bob Ross and Happy Little Trees, and so, and as it turns out, well, it was complicated because that's the best way. But like
Yeah.
playing with people's expectations, I guess, and somewhat subverting them, not all the time, because again, I think you want to try and not be too predictable. But I think doing that bait and switch sometimes is good, just enough to keep I want to say to keep them off balance, but in a sense to almost keep them balanced in the regard that okay, we noticed this, but we have to be discerning as to whether it's actually important or was it just a thing. Like, kind of keep them interested, but not force them to fixate. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, you want them to sort of be engaged and, trying to, relate to what's going on and connect with like the story and the setting and all of that. And yeah, like you said, like it can be an issue sometimes if it's like, oh, well, it's really hard to, imagine Bob Ross as the villain.
I think, though, kind of what you're pointing at is right. Maybe some of that kind of indefinite information or undefined information, maybe a better way to say it, can actually build your story. Like I played GM Phil ran a Star Wars game this year. I can't remember what it was called, but there was multiple kind of factions at work. And as it turns out, he said the session he ran of it that I played in, we did something that no other group had done, and so it created an entirely different dynamic in terms of how the end scene played out, because we chose to kind of get friendly with one particular side of this happening where no one else did.
Interesting.
And so to speak, he ran the same session, and I think that's kind of, in a sense, maybe where this is where the whole topic came to mind, right? Was like, well, so you want to run, I don't know, we'll say Massive Nyarlathotep, right? Classic Call of Cthulhu scenario. It's been published for years and years and years, and you try to run it and it's fallen flat, and you're going, well, but everywhere I read, people say this is amazing. Well, maybe it's because you're not being the right speaker. You know what I mean? And I, I'm not here to try and necessarily give everyone the answers to how to be the right speaker, but I think it's just worth thinking about.
Yeah. And I think that that's an experience that, again, I know I'm sounding like a broken record probably, but I think we've all sort of been there if we run a game where the players sort of take things in a direction you weren't expecting, and then you're suddenly forced to sort of throw the plans out the window or figure out, okay, well, how am I going to work this in now? And I think a
Yeah.
lot of that just comes from experience. We already talked about how if you've got a goal and you know what the ultimate goal is, then you can frame everything in terms of like, okay, how can this play into the goal, And I think practicing that and getting really good at thinking about that is really good. Alternatively, if you're having problems because things keep going off in a direction that you never intended, and maybe that is at odds sort of with the goals of the adventure, it can be good to practice the art of redirection to sort of get things back on track to where you want it to be. So, for example, like we were talking about the room with the stuffed heads, and if you just sort of use that as like a throwaway or just a way to get one of the senses in there for something interesting, but then your players are really fixated on it, and you have your particular goal in mind. If maybe it's sort of like they're just supposed to be meeting an NPC to get information. Maybe that's the point where you have the NPC walk in and say like, oh, I see you're admiring my heads, and then you can use that as a segue into like, well, I was actually out hunting, the other day, and this thing happened, and then you can give them the information from that or something like that. And so, you're including that detail in, but you're, then using it to accomplish the goal that you were originally trying to, do with the scene, to give them the information that they were there meeting the NPC for.
And sometimes you can just make it a quirk of some character. Like what you just said made me think, okay, so he was out hunting, right? Well, what if this particular individual, they want to experience hunting? And this may be just a complete tangent here, so bear with me for a second.
No worries.
This person has this collection of and when you said stuffed animal heads, I don't know if you were talking taxidermy. In my mind, it was like they have the heads of Care Bears and various other. Okay.
That's exactly what we were talking about before, about people's minds go to different places when you just mentioned the same thing. So, I mean, it's a perfect example right there. Yeah.
Like I guess maybe the proper or more appropriate term for what I was thinking would be plush animal heads on the wall.
There we go.
Why I went there, I don't know. But so, and this could just be a fun NPC for someone to use, right? So this individual has a collection of plush animal heads on the wall, even maybe mounted kind of taxidermy style. And what it really is they're like somehow obsessed with photography. And so they go take pictures of these animals and then go get, they took pictures of raccoons. So they get a plush raccoon head and put it on a plaque on their wall. Or
that would be very quirky. Yeah, no, could make for a very interesting character for sure.
I don't know.
Hey, now I'm going to have to challenge myself to throw that into my next game somehow. I don't know. We'll see how that goes.
Right?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Oh, yeah. But I think one of the tricky things about this topic is that in terms of being the right speaker, there is some degree of trial and error and just practice and skill, getting used to it. It's not something that you can necessarily just there's there's a formula that you follow and you become the right speaker. It's obviously a bit more complex than that.
Oh, absolutely. And like I said, it could even come down to, is the manner that you're speaking in when you're describing certain things kind of contradicting what you're wanting to get across? It could be any number of I used the example before about, you want it to be kind of tense and dramatic, and because you're a little nervous or you're a little hyper or any number of things, you kind of blow through it real fast. I think it's just something to be conscious of. Are you laughing and joking while you're describing the scene and it's supposed to be serious? And again, we're playing games to have a good time, so there's nothing wrong with the laughing and joking part. But I think at times, right, we can have so much fun that we're losing the greater goal in the moment. Does that? I don't know.
Right. No, I know it makes perfect sense. And to your point, with tone, setting the tone is a really important part, I think, of role playing because, it's sort of the way where we set expectations and we sort of get everyone on the same page. So, if you're trying to have a very serious and emotional sort of scene, but everyone's laughing and joking and making, side comments the whole time, then you're probably not going to get that emotional impact you wanted, from that scene. So keeping the goals in mind again is important for that. And then, there are obviously like I would call like advanced stagecraft sort of stuff they could do, or like storytelling where if you're trying to tell a really serious and emotional scene, you can slow down a little bit. And
Right.
you can talk with a very measured tone and really get people to start listening and focusing in on what you're saying
Hmm.
and maybe not, laugh and joke and go at a million miles per hour, but slowing down can sort of give more weight and focus on that moment so that you're sort of communicating the tone through the way you're speaking, like you were saying.
Yeah, and I think, there's a lot of techniques to storytelling and speaking because let's be honest, GMing, and I'm probably about to give some people some trauma here, but GMing is public speaking. It
Oh
really
no.
is. It's a very small audience, but it is still basically public speaking. And so I think, there are times where maybe sometimes, and again, maybe a little bit of a tangent here, but you can find really useful information in places you didn't expect. And you kind of led me into a month or two ago, for whatever reason. I wanted to listen to some comedy while I was at work. And I looked up this guy. I'd seen some clips on, like Facebook Reels or whatever of guy named Dave Nihill. He's this Irish comedian. And amongst the things that came up was him giving this talk at Google. And I'm like, what, comedian at and so apparently one of the things he does besides comedy is he actually does like public speaking seminars.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so what he was saying is he said one of the things he's learned to do with his stage routine is he actually and he said a lot of times you'll see comedians do this. They'll have a little tablet or something on a stool. He said mine doesn't actually have words on it. He said it's got a map. And he said what he does is his his stage routine is a series of stories that he equates with rooms on the map. And so he can just look at the map and go, "Oh wait, okay, I'm in the living room. It's this thing." And it was a really interesting perspective on I don't know exactly how to apply that to running an RPG, but I think the principle is really interesting and something that I'm sure can be applied in some form or other. But his gist was, like he's telling the story about how he gave his mother edibles when she broke her leg and was sitting in his living room. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's the part of the story that is the living room, the part of the map. So I don't know. I haven't tried this running a session, but that might be something worth kind of, just sketch yourself a doodle map and we're going, like you said, having the plan, right? So we're going from the cantina to the spaceport to out in space. And then I don't know, maybe that's oversimplifying it a little bit, but you know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah, for sure. And that's a really fascinating idea that you mentioned with this comedian, by the way. Maybe we can put that link to the talk in the
Yeah,
show
I'll
notes
try
or
and find
something
it.
for everyone to look at. Yeah,
Yeah.
because I definitely want to take a look. Yeah.
He also shared a really funny story about how when he was first getting into comedy, how he had written this book about the techniques that because when he started to get into comedy or anyway, it was kind of public speaking and comedy all mixing together. And so he wrote and like web published this book of techniques for like storytelling and public speaking. And so he enters this storytelling competition, I don't know, San Francisco or somewhere, and not really expecting to do well, just kind of wanted to see. Ends up coming in second place. And he says he's telling this whole story and he said, so I went and talked with the woman who won. And just, because I wanted to pick her brain and see, how she did things. And she said, and I think at that point he was going by a stage name of just like Irish Dave or something. And he said, so this woman, she was really friendly and everything. She goes, oh, I got pretty much everything I did from this book by this guy named Dave Nahill.
That's awesome.
She literally
Ironic
pointed him at his own work.
when someone is you better than you, right? But
But like I said,
oh
yeah,
man, that's awesome.
I'll definitely find that and put a link in the show notes and stuff. But like I said,
Yeah,
the guy's comedy I find quite funny too. So but like I said, this was he was talking about just different things you can do and how and I hadn't thought about this, but like your posture can affect how the audience pays attention to you. What you're doing with your
sure.
hands and I I'm watching this slash listening to it while I'm at work, so I'm not paying the most attention. But it's one of those things I definitely want to go back and like kind of dive into a little deeper as far as what can I glean from this. But like I said, I think sometimes you could, who would have thought, right? You go to a comedian to learn how to GM better, but at the same point, right? Storytelling, that's what comedy is. It's public speaking. It all really is the same thing, just a little bit different mix in the soup.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And I think a lot of people don't always think about that. But, and part of it depends on the medium now, obviously, because if you're playing online and you don't have video or whatever like that, then you're not going to have maybe that aspect of the physicality, with the way you're presenting yourself while you speak. But I think a lot of people do sometimes forget when they're playing in person or if they have video online or whatever, that humans a lot of times do look at body language and we can communicate a lot through our body language, and that can become a tool that we can use to communicate what we want. And so maybe in a roundabout way we've sort of gotten to, from your making that point, one of the ways to be a better speaker or the right type of speaker is to think about how can I use the tool of my physical presence to make the point that I wanted to make and accomplish what I was trying to do.
Mhm.
And obviously, there's no right or wrong answer, like we said. So, these are all just different tools that you can have in your arsenal that can all potentially work together to play into how do I be the best speaker for what I'm trying to do.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I've said it a bunch of times on the show. We're not here to give everyone the answers. We're here to try and get you to think about what the answer might be for you. And it
Sure. Yeah.
probably is different than it is for me or for JT or for Steve or anyone else.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think that really hits the nail on the head. I think really when it comes down to it with our hobby, everything is going to be about what works for you and the people at your table, and everyone has different needs and different goals and desires for what they're trying to get out of it. So
Yeah.
it's important to take that into consideration.
Oh, absolutely. All right. Well, it sounds like we've kind of gone around this topic at least enough to make people think. Do you have anything going on you want to give a shout out to or anything? I know you sometimes do and sometimes don't. So,
Yeah. I don't have anything special on a personal level, but we do just have a lot of great shows on the D20 Radio Network. As we mentioned at the beginning, we did add in a new show, and we might have new shows coming in the future. So definitely keep your ears peeled. I don't think that works. Maybe a mixed metaphor there, but
I know what there's a new website in the works and all kinds of fun stuff. If I'm not
yeah,
mistaken.
I mean, we're really trying to work hard to bring our listeners and fans the best possible experience. So, if you haven't already, too, obviously join the D20 Radio Discord and the Facebook group if you're on there. I'm usually around, and you can get a hold of me if you want to there. We can probably put those links in the show notes as well if you
I
want.
know there's a link, at least to the old website. I might throw a link to the D20 Discord in there as well, just because I don't think I have that in there. I know there's a link to that Discord in our Discord,
Right.
but
Yeah.
might put a direct link in there too.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, we have a lot of fun. Everyone sort of likes to talk about gaming stuff for different shows on the network, and some people will ask for help with, oh, how do I, do this thing in my game? And people will give advice, earned from, decades of GMing or whatever, So,
I don't want to think about the combined years of RPG experience on that
oh,
server.
geez. Oh, my goodness. Oof. Yeah.
That'd be a lot.
It's mind-boggling, I think, if you were to add it all up. But yeah, so yeah, great community, obviously. I mean, you're on it, so it has to be.
Well, I insist that I'm a figment of everyone else's imagination. I'm not real. Or
Yeah.
no, I'm a figment of my own imagination. I don't remember. Anyway. Speaking of fun, silly things, shall we do Game of the Week?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Game of the week. Game of the week.
All right, you going first or am I going first?
I'll let you go first, I think.
All right. So I'm going to go with a game that I know I've mentioned before on the podcast, but I don't think it's ever been brought up in Game of the Week. And this is a game I've actually played this, and I had a blast with it. So let me drop a link in the green room here so you can see this. So my Game of the Week this week is going to be a game called Heavy Metal Wizard Sorcerers.
Ooh,
and this
man.
came out of this thing, and Steve is a big fan of this. It's called the 200-word RPG challenge. And I think the premise of this is to write a, obviously very simple RPG in 200 words or less. So there's going to be a link for this in the show notes, because trying to read out the thing would be a pain in the neck. But I'm going to actually read you the entire text of the RPG. In the magical world of heavy metal, legendary hardcore rockers struggle against the evil hordes of pop, spell after spell. Think of a badass stage name and a short description of what you look like when beheld by mortal eyes. Under your name, in a column, the following 13 holy words of metal: fire, sword, ice, crown, steel, gold, blood, time, space, death, dragon, thunder, and then you make up the 13th.
How interesting.
Assign to each a number between 1 and 4 so that the total adds up to 25. Every time your rocker wants to cast a spell, string 3 words together in a phrase that sounds like the title of a metal song. For example, I cast Blood of the Death Dragon. Add their scores up and you roll that many d6s. Basically, a success is a 6 on the die. So if you roll at least 1 6, the spell succeeds. In a conflict against other rockers or pop stars, whoever rolls more 6s wins, and they get to decide what happens. Now, the effect of the spell is supposed to be related to the 3 words used. The Master of Metal, the GM, can veto a spell that makes no sense or is quote-unquote uncool. Now, also, if you roll 3 6s, you get to air guitar, and then you can increase the score of one of your words by 1.
That's awesome.
That is the entire text of the game, and I actually added a little bit in to make it a little more speaking friendly. But that is the whole game. I have played this. We had an absolute blast.
Yeah, I bet it sounds like a really metal time. Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm definitely gonna have to pick that up, I think, for sure.
Yeah, and like I said,
Well,
it's literally a free download. Like I said,
Yeah.
there'll be a link. I would assume you can download it. If not, I think the way it's formatted on the webpage, you could literally just copy and paste it.
Yeah, that's fair. Wow.
But like I said, I literally read you the whole game.
Yeah, no, that is a pretty good find. definitely go ahead and pick that up, I would say, folks.
All right, your turn.
All right, I hope I haven't suggested this one before, so let me know if you remember if I have or not. But I was thinking about it today, and there's a one-shot RPG called One Last Job.
I think I've heard of it, but it's been a while, and Lord knows
Okay.
that doesn't. It may or may not have been brought up here, so I don't
Yeah.
know.
And actually, the reason I was thinking about it was because, we were talking about Gamer Nation Con, and at this last Gamer Nation Con, I got to run a session of One Last Job just sort of as a pickup one-shot game.
Mhm.
And it's a collaborative storytelling type of game, and it's sort of meant to be able to be played fast and loose. But the premise is that everyone at the table, or in the playing a character, is the member of a heist group that had gone their separate ways because of the last job. Something went horribly wrong. And then they're all coming back together to pull one last job before they all finally go back into a retirement and hopefully live happily ever after. But the conceit is that your character sheet is generally formed as you play, because you end up being introduced at the beginning, and you're given a name, and someone will say like, oh yeah, well, in order to do this heist, we're going to need the best hacker around, Bob. And then someone gets to jump in and say, yes, Bob, and I do this and this and this. But then you also have things like you're rolling dice basically against a dice pool that the GM has every scene, and you can either try to decrease the number of dice the GM is rolling, or you can try to roll to get like a certain number of successes, basically to accomplish whatever the goal is of like that given scene, like that part of the heist. So like if you're doing the hacking part, then maybe you're trying to break into the mainframe, and so then you're either trying to get rid of the dangers involved with the hacking, or you're trying to like get further into the mainframe to get the information you need, whatever. And sorry that I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent. But the thing is that in order to get the skills that you need to do whatever you're doing, people tell stories about your character in play, and that will give you ratings or other types of abilities where you can be like, oh yeah, remember that time when Bob had to, use a flute and played it into like the public payphone or whatever to make the call without any spare change or whatever. I don't know, just some random thing. But then you can suddenly get this skill or ability that can then be used for the rest of the game for Bob. And you also have this story now that's added into sort of the world that you can then draw upon multiple times to do different things. But yeah, it's just a lot of fun because it's a lot of collaborative improv, and you're basically relying on everyone else at the table to help you get cool abilities and gear and stuff for your character by telling stories about what your character did in previous jobs and stuff like that. So it just becomes a lot of fun.
Is this the right one? Do
Yeah.
I have the right one linked to the green room?
Let me double check that. Yeah, that's it right there. Yeah, by Grant Howitt. Yeah. It's a very simple thing, but it's just a ton of fun.
I've played some Grant stuff, and his stuff is generally very, very good.
Yeah.
He's actually the mind behind Havoc Brigade.
Oh yeah, right. He and yeah, I mean basically the game is set up so that it's setting agnostic, so you can basically set it in any type of thing you want. Just the premise is that there's a heist of some sort. So it doesn't matter whether it's a fantasy heist or a sci-fi heist or I don't know, fairy tale heist, whatever. You could potentially run it as long as everyone's on board. And
yeah, you could
yeah.
be a backwards heist where it's a police raid on a criminal hideout headquarters.
Sure. Yeah, that would be a really interesting way to do it. But yeah, so and I remember that when I first heard about this game, it was actually through the One Shot podcast, which is on the One Shot Network, famous thing. But they're famous Chicago improv artists, yeah, James D'Amato and company, exactly. And they had like a couple different episodes of their session playing this One Last Job game, and it was hilarious. And I could not stop laughing just because it's the perfect sort of game for improvers where you're just sort of like making up stories and saying yes and doing all that stuff. And it just is so much fun if you have a gang that likes to, has that buy-in and willing to
Hmm.
do the work to make it happen.
Prepare yourself, but you should get some of the Daryl and the How We Roll crew to play this with you sometime. They're great fun for games like that.
Yeah, oh, definitely. I definitely will try to get that to happen maybe at the next GN Con. Who knows?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I will say GM Dave got treated to a round of he walks in at one point and we would just finish something up and he goes, "All right, who wants to play Everyone is John?" And he sat down with myself and Daryl and Steph and Nick and Robert and we proceeded to have a absolutely hysterical session of Everyone is John.
Oh yeah, everyone John is a lot of fun. But especially when you have people who love to do the improv and just the wacky off the cuff stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All
So
right.
all right. Well, I think that about wraps up the show. I think we gave some people to think of. Yeah, we gave some people some good things to think about as far as are you being the right speaker when you're telling your stories in your games, and hopefully they can take some of the game, maybe pick up one of the games of the week for some fun and practice and all that other cool stuff. And I think with all that, thank you for coming on and having a conversation with me, kind of on short notice, but much appreciated.
Oh no, my pleasure, Steve. It's always a blast to come on and talk with you. And I know the other Steve couldn't be here, but it's always
Yeah.
great to talk with him too. But
He did say to say hi.
oh yes, well, definitely say hi back for me then.
All right.
All right.
But I think with all that, like I said, there's going to be a bunch of links in the show notes. Be it for our Discord. But like I said, I'll probably throw one for the D20 Discord in there. There's links to our Patreon. There's links to our YouTube feed if you prefer to listen to your podcasts on YouTube. We now have a YouTube channel. Like I said, our Patreon, our Discord. Assorted other fun things, our drive-through affiliate link, all that fun stuff. But I think, with all that, y'all have a good time and just remember to be kind to each other and get out there and play some RPGs.
Yeah. Keep it cool.
Intro and outro music by the band 12 Noon. You can email us at meandsteverpg@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter and RPGs. Find us on Facebook at Me and Steve RPG Podcast. On Discord at Me and Steve RPGs. And as always, all of these links are in the show notes. Thank you, and be kind to one another.
How much for the cigar?
Cigar, $20, dog. You gotta go down the street to the store and buy that.